thank you for that kind introduction. It's such an honor to be speaking to you all tonight, and it's a little bit interesting because when I got the invitation to be the keynote speaker tonight, I have to say I was a little bit apprehensive. 4 years ago, I was the early 8 a.m. opener for the IDSA conference in Chicago, and I was opening right before the guy who designed the Xbox 360. So needless to say, the vibe about me on stage was a little bit more, get off the stage. So I want to show you a little bit about the audience that I was talking to then. They looked a little bit like this. And right down there, right in the front row, were 4 girls who all looked exactly alike, and they were waving at me from the front. And this is what they looked like. This is my community. This is the DIY community. And tonight, I want to introduce you to these people and hopefully give you a better understanding of what they're all about and what's motivating them, and hopefully how you can work together with this community to make better products. With tonight's speech, I want to try to teach you 5 things. First, that the DIY community is not in any way out to steal jobs or overshadow the professional design community. These are people who are just like the rest of us, who are motivated to create things and to try to solve problems around them the best that they can. Second, while this community has its share of problems, and I'm going to go through a little bit of those tonight, it has done more good than bad for the community as a whole. The third point is that the DIY community has sort of gone above and beyond itself to try to highlight the strength and the skill behind great design. And by doing that, they've created a more educated and more design-appreciative consumer, which benefits all of us. And another point I think is important to make tonight, which is there are failures in the DIY community. We're not doing everything perfectly, but these failures represent a great place for professional designers to step in and show us what you can do with your expertise. The DIY community needs and wants your help very much. And last but not least, this is sort of what everybody's been touching on in these introductions, is that these communities of crafters and DIYers and makers need to be working together with professionals. We can all benefit each other and in the end produce better things for our customers. So to start off, I want to tell you a little bit about my story. I think that in a lot of ways I'm the prototypical DIYer, and for me, Design Sponge was sort of the ultimate DIY project. When I graduated from college, I had pretty much half a degree in fine arts and half a degree in journalism, and wasn't exactly sure what to do with them. But when I graduated, I did know that none of the magazines, none of the outlets for design that I was reading, they weren't speaking to me. They weren't talking to me as a young woman. They weren't talking to me as someone who didn't have a lot of money. And they especially weren't talking to me as someone who was living where I was living. I was living in Brooklyn, New York, and fascinating things were happening. But nobody was talking about them. The magazines were talking about $2 million penthouses and things that I knew didn't relate to me at all. So I decided I had to create something that would speak to who I was. So I created Design Sponge. And basically the goal was to create a place for me to talk about what I loved. And I think it's important to note that what I did and what most DIYers are doing is we're not trying to replace what's already wonderful in the market. We're just trying to create something that's an alternative to it, or perhaps an additional resource. So when I started, I wasn't in any way hoping to take over magazines. I was just trying to have my voice be a part of the scene. And I decided, like most crafters, to work with the tools that I had. And for me, that was a laptop and an internet connection, and that was it. And I think like a lot of crafters, I was well aware of my limitations. I didn't have a lot of professional experience. I'd never published anything in my life, but I knew that I had something to say. So I decided I would focus on what I was good at. I thought I had a really good eye. I thought I was in a unique location to be talking about great design. And I thought that I was incredibly motivated. And I thought, there's got to be a way to turn what I love into something great and connect with people who feel the same way. So that was what I started to do. And the scene that I found in 2004 was really unique. First of all, I was living in Brooklyn right before the design scene exploded there. And if you're not familiar with sort of the Brooklyn design world, it was a really interesting place to be in 2004. People were incredibly interested in the idea of turning things that were throwaway objects, disposable containers, into permanent works of art. So there was a lot of sort of tongue-in-cheek creation going on. There were a lot of plastic takeout containers being cast in porcelain. It was an interesting place to be, and it was a lot about working with found materials. And when I wasn't going to Brooklyn design shows, I was spending a ton of time at Pratt and SBA and schools where I could sort of immerse myself in sort of the raw talent that was happening in New York at the time. And what I was seeing was a lot of salvage materials. This was sort of the beginning of the craft community working its way into the beginning of the these young designers that were just sort of getting their feet wet in the world of professional design were obsessed with using salvage materials. They wanted to work with felt. They wanted to work with industrial byproducts. And what I was seeing then was less of craft and more of design. And so when I started Design Sponge, what I decided to do was not to focus on craft, but to focus on these designers that I was seeing. And I think it's an important distinction to make because people weren't talking about craft in 2004, but there was craft happening. And I think the reason for that was that I think people were nervous that craft might seem a little bit less skilled. A lot of people doing it didn't have professional educations. And for the most part, it felt intensely personal. And the design we were seeing around us wasn't so much personal as it was about working with a group of people to work with found materials and create something different. And crafters weren't doing that. They were saying, I'm sitting in my garage, I'm sitting with a group of girls, and this is what I'm knitting. And that just didn't seem like it was going to be accepted. So I decided to focus on what I saw around me and just the general cool things happening in the market. And these are some pictures of things that I wrote about in the very first week of posting that I ever did. And you can see this is your prototypical Brooklyn design. This is Scrap Pile on the top left, which is a group working with salvaged woods they were finding around them. There's an industrial felt chair on the right made with byproducts that they were collecting around them. Brooklyn is sort of a wonderland of found materials. And so the designers around me were obsessed with using recycled, plastic bottle tops like the chair on the bottom left. Everybody was finding, salvaging, and making something out of it. And that was great. And so I went along like that for, about 2 years. And then in 2006, something hit me. And that something that hit me was Career Machine. And I think that one of the most controversial things I said on the site early on was that if I see something else from this man, I think I'm going to puke. Because, frankly, and I've gone on to completely love his attitude on reality shows, and that's great, but tell me where there's a personality in those chairs. Tell me the individual that's being spoken to in that plastic block of furniture. It's not happening. And so after 2 years of covering things like this, I was sick of it. I didn't want to see any more plastic, and I wanted to see the maker's hand in something. I was just really tired of hearing about designers over the work. I wanted the work to show me what they were doing. So I decided to move towards the craft movement. And in the design blog scene, that was a bit of an original move in the beginning. Everybody was talking about what Philippe Stark was doing, and what Career Machine was doing, and what Vitra and Noel and everybody else was doing. And I decided I don't want to go that direction anymore. I want to look at what people are doing who are really passionate about what they're creating. So I decided I was going to focus on things that were happening around me, that were happening with small-scale design, and that were happening with individuals who weren't famous, who weren't from design schools, and might be people in your neighborhood. So the way I started doing this was paying attention to this very beginning rebirth of craft. And that was happening at places like the Renegade Craft Fair, which had been around for a few years, but people weren't really paying attention to that much. I started attending every one that I could get my hands on. I would go to these events, I would carry cameras, and I would pay attention to the trends happening and seeing what people were working with. And then around this time was the birth of Etsy. And if you're a crafter and you're in the DIY community, it's almost impossible to imagine life pre-Etsy. But there was a point when Etsy wasn't around. And when it first opened, it was amazing. Etsy then wasn't exactly what it is now. It was sort of a place for people who were already designing to suddenly have a place to sell. It wasn't yet the place where everyone who decided they could pick up a glue gun and be a crafter sold something. It was a place where people who already had great ideas were selling. And then practically overnight, just about everyone and their brother or rather their sister had a craft blog. Girls everywhere were starting blogs. Everyone was taking classes. And Meetup.com was full of overnight knitting groups where everyone would get together and knit things and watch TV. Everybody was paying attention to handmade work, and things exploded overnight. So while this was all great and lots of creation was happening, there were some bumps along the way. And I want to sort of walk through these because I think that they're some of the things that people use as an excuse to marginalize this community. But I think we can learn from some of these little growing pains.